Okay, Dr. Mark Dombeck is a licensed psychologist with over 30 years of experience specializing in complex trauma and dissociation. With clinical training from UCSD and Yale Psychiatric Hospital, he has dedicated his career to helping adults heal from childhood and relational trauma that traditional approaches often struggle to address. Dr. Dombeck is experienced working with the full spectrum of trauma presentations, including dissociative symptoms and more complex cases that other therapists may find challenging. He integrates evidence-based trauma therapies, including trauma-informed stabilization treatment, internal family systems, EMDR, acceptance and commitment therapy, and clinical hypnosis to help clients move beyond symptom management toward genuine healing and integration. His approach emphasizes creating safety first and then systematically addressing dissociated emotions and conflicted internal parts while minimizing the need to relive painful memories. He practices in Alameda, California, working with adults both in person and online throughout the state. Visit psychtools.com to learn more about Dr. Dombeck's approach to trauma treatment. Thank you so much for joining me today for this discussion.
Hey.
Yay! I'm so excited for it. So, Dr. Dombeck, I guess we should start. We'll start people watching this who don't even know what complex trauma is. Can we discuss a little bit what that even is?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
So the trauma diagnosis is not ancient. Um, the modern version of the trauma diagnosis dates back to roughly the 1970s in the wake of the Vietnam War. It was known that people become traumatized, but it wasn't what we would today call post-traumatic stress. So older terms like shell shock or hysteria are what you would find in the much older literature.
Mhm.
So, as it was originally conceived, it has to be understood in its cultural moment. And the cultural moment was veterans returning to the United States from the Vietnam War and having difficulty reintegrating into society. So, the experience of a combat veteran is often a violent one. And the way that the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis was formed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, the North American Psychiatry Bible, as it were, um, emphasized violence. A trauma researcher, Judith Herman, a psychiatrist, writing in the 1990s, a couple years after that, published a wonderful book that anyone who is interested in trauma ought to read. It is called, I believe, Trauma and Recovery. And in that work, she kind of traces the history of the trauma diagnosis and came up with this concept of complex trauma. So, complex trauma is a kind of a distinct beast from what I would call today simple trauma, or the way that the diagnosis is written into DSM, even to this day. Um, Simple trauma means that you have, theoretically, okay, this is important because it's never as clean as it is written about in the diagnostic manuals.
Sure.
There are assumptions, and the assumption is that we have an adult who has come into adulthood relatively unscathed and then encounters something violent, right? So initially that was combat stress. That could be rape. That could be, waking up on the operating table. That could be any number of things, motor vehicle accidents. And as a result of that, the nervous system is overloaded, and three kind of symptom groups show up, the hallmarks of complex, rather, of post-traumatic stress. And these are um, intrusions into your daily life. So your going about your business, and suddenly the memory of the awful event intrudes unwelcome into your mind. As a result of this happening, you reorganize how you're living so that you avoid things that might trigger that memory. And number three, hypervigilance. Your nervous system gets jacked up into a kind of a permanent scanning for danger. When is it going to reoccur? So this is simple trauma or post-traumatic stress as it's typically understood. Complex trauma, as Herman conceived it, is different. And what makes it different is that the events that kick off the trauma, the traumatic stress itself, occur during the developmental period. So during childhood, okay? And as a result, the normal developmental course of the human being is altered from what it would otherwise be. And complex trauma is also to be less of kind of a singular insult and more of like death by a thousand cuts, right? It's a million little moments of powerlessness, of overwhelm. And a lot of times people who have complex post-traumatic stress or CPT as it's known, or sometimes we would call it relational trauma, um, they can't point to a single moment that's when my world, because in essence, the world never was safe. So part of what the implication of this is that in the normal course of development, when we might talk about someone coming to adulthood through a normal course of development, whatever that is, if
Right.
that exists,
Right.
we would be presupposed attachment relationships.
Okay.
So this gets us into attachment theory, which is
Okay.
why we would call complex trauma relational trauma. It has to do with the gut level, low level feeling of safety in the world. And in complex trauma, it never gets to form in the first place. So it is not a matter of simply working with an overwhelming bubble of stress that the body and the brain has not been able to digest. It is more like a full reconstruction of what would have been
Okay.
if the traumatic stress in childhood had never occurred.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Dombeck. Actually, if you don't mind me asking about this, because this is a question that's a little bit confusing to me, and I
Mhm.
hope it's not too big, but hopefully it's not too big. But is that why borderline personality disorder gets confused in this diagnosis? Is it the same thing, or is it actually something different?
That's a wonderful question, and no, it's not too big.
Okay, thank you.
Uh, so, in order to understand borderline personality disorder, you have to understand a little bit about the history of how that whole complex of personality disorders it came to be.
Okay.
And that history, the modern way of thinking about it, which is empirical and strives to be scientific, is new. I think it was only introduced with DSM-3. The early DSMs were based on psychoanalytic and psychodynamic formulations.
Okay.
So this would be the legacy and the tradition that grew from Freud's work. Wonderful, good stuff, nothing
Right.
wrong with it.
Right.
But as it came into contact with North American behaviorism, which was a distinct scientific or just a totally different way of understanding what's, um, there were kind of theoretical clashes about what are you talking about? this doesn't make any sense. So for a long time, the way they handled it was they developed what was called the axial system of diagnosis. It's no longer in use, but say DSM-3 and I think even the fourth one used this five-axis diagnostic process where you would have the main diagnoses like post-traumatic stress that assumed normal development. And then there was axis 2, which was for the developmental disorders, of which there are many and far more encompassing than just trauma. And the personality disorders were understood to be like that. So they handled it based on a kind of separate but equal structure.
Okay.
Um, in the fifth edition, they got rid of that artificial division, but the kind of confusion remains. Is
Right.
borderline personality just trauma? And there's another confusion, which is trauma even recognized? Because a lot of the way that disorders are described in the DSM is symptom-based, kind of like we don't care how you got there. We just care whether it coheres into the form of depression or it coheres into the form of anxiety.
Okay.
It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of like we just want to know the symptoms and we're going to treat the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about trauma, you're talking about where does it come from? How did you get here? So it's a whole different way of approaching the diagnostic process. So when you talk about a trauma diagnosis, and if you compare that, let's say, to a depression diagnosis, they're really different ways of thinking about what's happening because depression is agnostic as to how you got there. Trauma is not. So borderline personality disorder, the way I think about it is now you're talking about nature versus nurture.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And you're what you're basically confronted with is did the person start to behave in this way of behaving that we call borderline, which is
Mm-hmm.
characterized by splitting,
Mm-hmm.
really dissociative kinds of ways of managing emotions and
Okay.
identity.
Right.
Is that because they were born that way? Or is that because they were traumatized and that configuration of how they act is in fact a trauma symptom? Okay. And I don't
Okay.
think anybody really definitively knows,
Right. Right.
but the way that I would talk about it is a lot of people who receive the borderline personality disorder diagnosis would qualify for the complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't think that there's a lot of difference because they're just coming back to the two ways of thinking about diagnosis that I mentioned earlier. Borderline is more like depression. It's just, are the symptoms there? And trauma would be, how did we get there? But I do want to reserve the
Mm.
possibility that some people's brains are just born neurodivergent,
Mm-hmm.
let's say,
Mm-hmm.
and it predisposes them to become that way in the absence of a traumatic background.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. That's absolutely fascinating. And so something just stuck in my mind as you were talking there, because this also is a definition that confuses me a little bit as well. What exactly is dissociation or splitting? Are they the same things? What exactly is that symptom?
Going for the easy questions.
Yeah.
Um, Dissociation has vexed me throughout my career because I was raised as a behaviorist in the cognitive behavioral tradition. And the cognitive behavioral tradition really just says, well, here's this thing, but we can't measure it, so we're not really going to focus on it. They kind of ignore it. Um, and it's really mostly been a construct within the psychodynamic way of thinking about things.
Okay.
But if you're a working clinician, as
Mhm,
I have been,
mhm.
people show up, and the only way to understand what's happening is that they're dissociating. So that happened to me maybe 10 years ago. Um, and I started scrambling around trying to figure out, oh gosh, what do I do with these folks? How can I help them?
Mhm.
And that led me down a whole bunch of rabbit holes until I became, interested in all of the material that I've worked with and studied. And um, basically, it got me to where I am today. So I'm kind of grateful for dissociation. Um, so let me try to explain what it is. These days, we would talk about two distinct forms of dissociation, but before I go into that, I should just say, what is it?
Mhm.
It's narrowing of attention and possibility.
Okay.
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 Our minds are representational. So as I sit here and talk to you, as you sit there and talk to me, we are representing each other in the task that we're engaged in, which is a conversation.
Mhm.
And you're asking me questions, and I'm having to think about, what is that question and how do I explain it? And what does it mean to be in a conversation?
Mhm.
And there is a certain richness in the model that I can bring to bear, and a certain richness in the model, presumably, that you can bring to bear. And as I'm sitting here, I'm aware of, my body is sitting in the chair, and I can feel the fan in the room blowing a little air on me. And I'm thinking, am I answering well enough? But I have to keep giving you, some words uh, for our task here. I'm aware of all of these different possibilities. Okay. In dissociation, attention narrows, and some of those possibilities drop out. So, for instance, there's a form of dissociation where I could lose the sensation of my body. We would call that depersonalization. There's a form of dissociation where I could lose the sense of time or identity. We call that dissociative amnesia. Okay, so
Okay.
it's a restriction of what attention can represent.
Okay.
So that's kind of the broadest, most simple way of thinking about what's going on. It's an attentional trick,
Okay.
okay, or a
Mhm.
manipulation of attention by the brain. Now, then we can distinguish dynamic dissociation and structural dissociation.
Okay.
Dynamic dissociation is like when you're driving and you're lost in thought and you drive by your stop and then you go, oh, what was I thinking? That happened to me last night as I was dropping my child and another child off from returning from an athletic event. I drove right by the other kid's house and she was like, "Hey," I was like, "So,"
Yep.
but I got lost in thought. So it's a
Mhm.
restriction of my attention, and I lost the thread that I was aiming, which was drop the kid off at the right house.
Right.
Okay. Um, a deeper level of that is derealization or depersonalization. So I'm dealing with really stressful stuff, and then something just kind of clicks inside my nervous system, almost like a circuit breaker blowing. And suddenly it feels like I'm playing a video game where I am the guy going through my life and I am somehow stepped back from my actual experience. Or some people will talk about, I feel like a robot, I feel wooden, I
Okay.
feel unable to feel. I have worked with people that had no experience of emotion. They could kind of see, almost like through a pane of glass, that something was there, but they
Wow.
couldn't they couldn't touch it. They couldn't experience it.
Wow.
Depersonalization is when this happens to the sense of your identity, your felt sense of being in the world. Depersonalization, rather derealization, the other end of it, the other side of that coin, is when the world becomes this alien, wrong experience. And then, of course, it gets more and more intense, and then we get, the classical phenomena like fugue, and all the way at the far end of the spectrum, dissociative identity disorder, what used to be called multiple personality disorder.
Okay.
So it's any alteration of attention in this narrowing way. Now, structural dissociation is a newer idea, although I think it's been implicit to some extent in the literature for a long time. It's, unique to this century in its modern formulation. Um, this is the book
Okay.
which it was written about, The Haunted Self, by, I've never been able to pronounce the names of these fellows, Onu van der Hart, Eilert Nijenius, I
Okay.
guess, and Kathy Steele.
Okay. Thank you.
And this is not really a great book for lay people to read.
Right.
Um, it's real dense. Um, I mean, I wouldn't say that it's a bad book to read, but it's just not written as an easy read. It's written as an academic book.
Right.
It basically talks about the division of the sense of self that gets cleaved by traumatic experience according to kind of fracture points that are built into the human neurology, the architecture of the brain. So they distinguish three levels of structural dissociation. The first level is a division between what they called the, what did they call it? The apparently normal self and the emotional self, or the apparently normal personality and the emotional personality. And the way to think about this is the fracture point is the cortex of the brain, including the prefrontal cortex, becomes structurally distinct, like the bridges get wiped out from the midbrain and the brain stem, where most of the emotions are being generated. And when this happens, and this happens to everybody,
Right.
think about a time that you've gotten really angry or really afraid. Okay.
Hmm.
What tends to happen is that your sense of rationality just sort of goes on vacation
Hmm.
and you
Hmm.
become possessed by the spirit of the emotion.
Hmm.
That's an experience of level one structural dissociation. Okay. And
Okay.
so what that means is now the brain is operating kind of as two distinct modules that vie for control. And sometimes the cortex is in control, and sometimes the emotions are in control.
Okay.
And then the other levels are more and more fragmentation built on that general structure. So structural dissociation is not thought of as a temporary phenomena. It's structural, it's architectural. And so when we start to talk about things like multiple personality, how on earth could that happen? What we're talking about is someone who had a complex trauma starting in the earliest years of their lives, which utterly defeated and destroyed the possibility of safety in the world, where that person learned to cope and probably was born with a gift of making these dissociations a way that they could function, because people vary in terms of their ability to dissociate. And they leaned into it as a way of coping and surviving. And a dissociative identity disorder is one that is so fragmented that not only is the cortical self broken into kind of distinct chunks with distinct and discrete identifications, but so too are the emotional levels.
Thank you very much. And that actually leads me perfectly to my next question. And I know this is going to depend on the severity.
Mhm.
Also, you mentioned it in your bio. Realistically, can this issue be, can you recover from something like that? Or does it really, I mean, on the extreme end, are you just talking about symptom management? Or are these issues able to be treated and uh, dealt with if the person really wants to commit to doing that?
Yeah. Yes and no.
Right, right, of
Uh,
course.
so the first thing to say, I guess, is, I want to anchor structural dissociation at the far extreme end in dissociative identity. But I don't want to give the impression that that's a common experience.
Right.
It might be more common than most of us have thought, but it is not a common experience.
Right.
Okay, it is a
Okay.
minority experience.
Hmm.
Um, it is a real thing, but it is not the average person's experience. It is not even the average person who has complex post-traumatic stress's experience.
Right.
Okay? What's much closer to the average experience is the experience of what we would call parts. Okay.
Hmm.
Um, so if we're going to talk about parts, which we need to answer the question,
Hmm.
then we need to understand that moving back towards the less extreme end on a spectrum of structural dissociation from zero structural dissociation to complete structural dissociation, somewhere in the middle is the common experience. And even, just anybody who's lived life for a while will have the experience of having moments of passion where one circuit in the brain, usually an emotional circuit, just takes over and for a while runs the show.
Right.
Okay. So at some level, that is an experience of structural dissociation, but it's a very normal human experience and it's not pathological. The experience of complex stress, complex traumatic stress, tends to fragment the human personality. Okay,
Hmm.
so the more that you've been exposed to it, the more likely you are to functionally be walking around with different aspects of yourself, which you almost could think of as gears that you get stuck in. For instance, a lot of people that I have worked with complex post-traumatic stress really get stuck in anger. They cannot exit or leave anger because by the time that they arrive to see me, they feel like so much injustice has happened to them
Hmm.
that, not only is the world sort of fundamentally corrupt and horrible, but, they just can't separate their identity from the experience of this outrage at the injustice. So for a long time, clinicians have understood that people can flip between these gears. You could think, I think a gearbox like on an old standard shift car is a
Hmm.
good metaphor.
Right.
Um, there's such a long, old tradition of thinking in this way. I mean, if we just even go back to everyone has heard of Freud's ego and id, and that is in some sense a model of structural dissociation. It just wasn't called that at the time, and it's not very sophisticated compared to how we might think about it today. Um, but it's basically saying the mind has divisions and we
Right.
can be influenced from either end. A more modern incarnation of this is something called internal family systems, or IFS. It's a treatment modality, and it basically understands that dissociation is normal.
Hmm.
Structural dissociation is normal. It's even more normal if you have been through a complex post-traumatic stressful series of events. And the way that that's going to manifest is that you are going to get stuck in particular gears. Okay, so you may
Okay.
have part of you that can go to work and function at work, and then you may go
Mm-hmm.
home and just collapse into depression. And sometimes you may just feel like a complete mess. And then out of that, you may flip into like, no, no, I have to, fight all of this horror.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the observation that this isn't happening randomly. There's actually structure to it. And IFS goes further in saying there are predictable structures. So, for instance, the anger that someone might have is in relationship to the collapsed depression, the hopelessness that they may have. In IFS, they would talk about the collapsed hopelessness as an exile, a part of human experience, a part of a particular person's experience that they do not want to have because it hurts so much, like a splinter that you can't get out of your skin.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just like the way a splinter would enter into your skin, and what would your body do? It would grow a little pocket around it, like a little cyst, to cushion it and protect the rest of the body from that toxic thing.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the mind does the same thing. And the anger would be understood as having a protective or shielding function. It exists to prevent the human being from having to feel that horrible, shameful, powerless, hopeless feeling. And this is the most common pattern that I see, right? People have this sort of vulnerable experience and they don't want to have it, so they flip into anger. And most of the time, they don't even notice that that's what's happening.
Amazing.
So IFS would
Mm-hmm.
basically say, let's understand that these are predictable patterns. Let's encourage people to start thinking about their experience as experiences that they are having rather than I am angry or I feel hopeless. We would want people to begin to say, there's a part of me that feels hopeless. There's a part of me that feels furiously angry at the injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And I, the observing self, which IFS, they capitalize the S. It
Mm-hmm.
has a special meaning. But I would think about it as basically the cortical self, the part of self that has the capacity to solve problems, to be mindful, um, which is also the experience of existing in time, to be able to think about what comes next and to model possibilities like, do I want to be impulsive in terms of how I solve a problem, or do I want to hold back even though I don't feel like I want to, because I'll get a better outcome later? That is only possible with the cortical mind being applied to the problem. The emotional components of mind are completely embedded in the present moment, and all they want to do is fulfill their survival function. So anger wants to kill, and fear wants to run away, and depression wants to melt and hide.
That makes sense.
So
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure I'm bringing this back to answer your
Mm-hmm.
question, which is how can people find help? Through a process of psychotherapy, which may involve internal family systems and many, many other techniques and technologies that we
Mm-hmm.
have these days. Yes, help is available, and it usually follows a particular pattern. And the pattern is we need to help you to regain emotional control. And that has to do with a concept called the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance basically says there's an operating range for the cortex.
Right.
If we leave the operating range of the cortex's ability to predict the future and show us the path will disappear, and we will become dominated by our emotional states. So there is no mindfulness when we're outside the window.
Right.
So the very
Hmm.
first part is teach people how to calm themselves down, how to self-soothe. The next part is generally going to encourage their ability to observe what's happening inside them. We could talk about that as building mindfulness, but different traditions use different words for that.
Okay.
And then through a variety of techniques, we want to do essentially work that helps the various fragmented experiences within the self to cohere and integrate and accept the leadership of the observing self, that part of self which is best suited to do this job because it's the only part that can really point the way that is safest and best.
Right.
All
Right.
the other all the other paths are impulsive.
Absolutely.
Now, the caveat here is damage is damage.
Yeah.
You know, if you've been put through the ringer
Mhm.
and, your adult experience is fragmented, it may never be the experience of someone who had the privilege of growing up in a healthy household and, free of trauma. You're not ever gonna get that possibility.
Right.
So it's not a cure. It's more like a way of working within the possibilities that are available to that person. How can we help them to become as integrated and self-authoring as possible?
Yeah. That's amazing. And Mark, we were talking earlier about how you're writing now. I mean, where do you see the evolution of your work in this field going? It's so interesting to me. I could talk to you all day about this.
Well, right now, 2025,
Mhm.
October, I I have too many things that I want to write about, but I'm structuring it broadly into two paths. One path is I am working on a trauma-informed vision of how to help people with executive function problems.
Okay.
So people with ADHD,
Hmm.
people with autism
Hmm.
spectrum, also
Right.
people with bipolar disorder and complex trauma. Really the range of psychopathologies that make it hard to be a functional human being who's going to work, right? Who has to live with the expectations. So I'm working on a whole bunch of, ultimately, it will be a blog series and a bunch of courses that I want to produce, but it's still a little bit more embryonic. Um,
Understand.
and in the process, that came first. And then in the process of that, I realized I wanted to write about trauma and, how do I actually explain trauma? So I am presently working on and hope to begin actual writing a series to be called Trauma Explained.
It's
And the
great.
vision is, do you remember Carl Sagan's Cosmos?
I don't know.
Okay, you're too young.
Yeah, no, I don't. Please educate me.
When I was a kid in the 80s, uh, wow, age really just kicks in. When I was a kid back in the day, there was an astrophysicist out of Cornell University named Carl Sagan.
Really?
And his contemporary figure would, I guess, be Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Okay, I know who that is. Sure.
Okay, but
Hmm.
Neil was just a fanboy for Carl.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
apparently not as nice of a human being as well. But what
Interesting.
Carl did is, I guess he got together with the American public media, and he produced a series called Cosmos. And the series was basically, explaining to the lay audience astrobiology. like how did the solar system
Right.
form? What's the Big Bang and what are the stars and what is the nature of the universe?
Hmm.
And it was groundbreaking because, of course the scientists were all into this stuff, but they're not generally able to communicate it in a way that, someone who is curious about it could really deeply understand what the scientists had learned.
Right.
So Carl was one of these people that kind of broke ground in terms of, lay communication. So my aspiration is to do what Carl did for the cosmos, only I want to do it for trauma.
Excellent. That's fantastic. That's fantastic and desperately needed. And I found you, Mark, through an article that we've talked about previously, but where can people follow your current work and what you're doing and where you're going with that? What's the best place to
All
follow
of
what
these
you're doing?
things, yeah,
Yeah.
I wish I was further along.
No, no,
Um,
no.
but my practice website is right now really what I have.
Hmm.
And my practice website is psychtools.com.
Okay. I'll link to that.
So when you go to psychtools.com,
Hmm.
what you will find is basically that's my clinical private practice website. But I also am posting a lot of writings there under a section called Journal. Eventually, because these projects have grown too big in my mind to fit here, I will have other places like I imagine traumaexplained.com will be one of them. But for now, really anyone who wants to follow what I'm doing would need to
Hmm.
go to psychtools.com.
Psychtools.com. Thank you. I will certainly link to that. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today and educate me on this topic here. It was a phenomenal conversation. It just flew by. Thank you so much.
I
It was
am
just great.
I'm grateful
Yeah,
for
me
the
too.
opportunity.
Me too. Thank you so much. And I hope we can do it again.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dombeck.
Okay.
I'm just gonna